The speckled cow stood alone at the edge of the pen, ribs showing beneath a dull coat, and every man within 20 miles agreed she wasn't worth the trouble of feeding. Mabel Cross had 31 years of hard living behind her, a dead father, and a homestead claim that most of her neighbors figured would fail before the next frost. When rancher Dale Whitmore showed up at her gate that Tuesday morning with his troublesome cow and an offer nobody else had taken, the sensible thing, the obvious thing, was to tell him no. She had barely enough feed to carry herself through spring. One more mouth was a gamble she couldn't afford. She said yes, anyway. What happens next is a story about the things nobody sees coming. The stubborn woman, the unwanted animal, and a small Kansas farm that became something neither of them was supposed to be. If this story reaches you, wherever you're watching from tonight, drop a like and leave your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The morning Dale Whitmore rode up to her gate, the sky was the color of old iron, flat gray pressing down low over the prairie, threatening rain that probably wouldn't come. That was the cruelty of Kansas in late spring. It looked like weather all day long and gave you nothing. Mabel was out at the fence line when she heard hooves. She had been up since before first light, resetting a post that had heaved during the last freeze and never quite settled back. The ground here was contrary that way. You could pound something solid into the earth, and 3 months later find it cocked sideways like it was trying to leave. She had a blister forming on her right palm from the mallet handle, and her lower back was already complaining, and she was not in a mood for visitors. She shaded her eyes and watched Dale Whitmore come down the lane on his big gray gelding, trailing a rope behind him. At the end of that rope was a cow. She was spotted, black and white, and one patch of reddish-brown across her left hip that didn't quite match either color. Big-boned and narrow-backed at the same time, which shouldn't have been possible, but there she was. Her tail switched once, lazily, and she walked with the particular unhurried quality of an animal that had long since stopped caring what the human at the other end of the rope wanted from her. Dale pulled up short of the gate. He was a big man, Dale Whitmore, wide through the shoulders, weathered red in the face, with a gray mustache that he kept too long. He had about 400 acres to the northwest, and a reputation for knowing cattle the way some men knew cards. He was also, in Mabel's experience, exactly the kind of man who talked at length about what women couldn't understand. "Miss Cross," he said, and touched his hat. "Mr. Whitmore." She set the mallet down and came to the gate, but didn't open it. "What can I do for you?" He glanced back at the cow. The animal had stopped walking and was now investigating a clump of dead grass at the edge of the lane with what appeared to be genuine skepticism. "I've got a problem," Dale said, "and I'm wondering if it might be your solution." "I don't follow." He sighed through his nose. "This animal. She's been nothing but grief since I bought her out of the Eaton stock 2 falls ago. Won't stay with the herd. Wanders off, goes her own direction, doesn't give a damn where she ends up. Lost her 3 times last summer. Found her once all the way down past the creek bed, just standing there in the shade like she owned the place." He shook his head. "I've got 70-some head to manage. I can't be chasing this one all over the county." Mabel studied the cow. The animal had given up on the dead grass and was now simply standing, staring at something in the middle distance that neither of them could see. "So you're looking to sell her," Mabel said. "Looking to get rid of her before I lose my patience entirely," Dale said. "Woman over in Hadley thought she wanted her. Brought her back inside a week. Fella down past the junction tried her out and said she broke through a fence on him twice." He paused. "I'll be honest with you. If she doesn't find a home in the next couple of weeks, I'm sending her to slaughter. She's more trouble than she earns." Mabel looked at the cow again. The animal turned her head then, slowly, and looked back. Brown eyes, large and damp, with a quality that Mabel could only describe later as watchful, not dumb animal watchful. Something more deliberate than that. "What are you asking for her?" Dale named a price that was low enough to tell her everything she needed to know about how little faith he had in the transaction. She should have said no. She knew it even standing there. She had $14 saved from selling eggs through the winter, half a quart of wood left for the stove, and feed enough to carry her 2 goats and the old draft horse through the next month if she was careful. A cow that wouldn't stay put was the last thing she needed. "I'll take her," she said. Dale blinked. It was the blink of a man who had already half composed the story he was going to tell about how the stubborn cross woman had turned him down too, and now he had to revise the whole thing. "Miss Cross," he said slowly, "I want you to understand. This animal is not going to be easy." "Nothing out here is easy," Mabel said, and opened the gate. Her name was Clover, which Mabel decided on the walk back up the lane, though she wasn't sure yet if names were something this particular cow would recognize or simply ignore. The homestead was modest by any measure. A two-room house she and her father had built in 1887, the summer they arrived, with a lean-to kitchen added the following year that always smelled faintly of the dried onions hanging in the rafters. A small barn, a chicken coop that listed slightly to the east, a kitchen garden that was barely waking up behind a low wire fence. The pasture behind the barn was maybe 4 acres of rough grass, uneven and stubbled with wild yarrow and patches of thistle that she fought back every season and never quite defeated. It wasn't much, but it was hers, legally hers, the deed recorded in her name after her father died in December, and that fact still carried weight every time she walked the property. There were people in town who doubted it would stay hers. Some of them were polite about the doubt. Some weren't. She put Clover in the pasture and watched her for a while, leaning on the fence rail. The cow moved slowly along the far edge of the field, nose low, testing the grass. She passed by the thickest patches without stopping and moved instead toward a lean, weedy strip near the old elm, where the ground was shadier and the grass grew finer and shorter. Mabel frowned. The thick grass was the obvious choice. That was what a cow was supposed to eat. But Clover wasn't interested in obvious. She settled herself in the shade of the elm and began to graze in that particular slow, methodical way of hers, like she was working through a problem rather than just eating. Mabel watched until the first drops of rain finally came, the rain the sky had been threatening all morning, and then went inside to start supper. The Crossing Creek homestead sat about 6 miles northeast of the town of Gilmore, which was not large enough to justify most of what it called itself, but had a general store, a feed merchant, a post office operating out of the back of the hardware shop, and a small community church that Mabel attended irregularly and without particular spiritual conviction, mostly because not attending caused more trouble than it was worth. Gilmore also had opinions, and it had them loudly. The opinion on Mabel Cross was familiar by now. She'd been hearing versions of it since her father's cough got bad the previous winter, and people started calculating, before he was even in the ground, what would happen to the claim. A woman alone couldn't work it. A woman alone shouldn't try. The sensible thing was to sell before she got too far in debt, move back east to some relation, or find herself a husband who knew what he was doing. Mabel had heard these opinions, processed them, and filed them without response, which was its own kind of response. The women were sometimes worse than the men about it, which she hadn't expected when she was younger but which no longer surprised her. There was a particular kind of cruelty that came wrapped in concern, delivered with soft eyes and a hand on the arm. "Oh, Mabel, I just worry about you, out there all alone." The man she was most conscious of was not Dale Whitmore but his neighbor, Frank Greer, who ran a dairy operation, 7 cows, a small separator he was proud of, and a regular arrangement supplying butter and cream to 2 of the hotel kitchens in Gilmore. Frank had made clear, on at least 2 separate occasions that Mabel was aware of, that if she ever found herself in need of help managing the property, he was available to discuss purchasing the eastern quarter of her claim at a fair price. The eastern quarter was where her best water was. She had declined both times with a politeness she didn't entirely feel. Clover spent her first week on the Crossing Creek homestead doing exactly what Dale Whitmore had warned her she would do. She explored the fence line. She tested every post along the east boundary with what appeared to be scientific thoroughness, leaning her weight against each one and watching what happened. She did not break through. The fence held, mostly because Mabel had spent the better part of 3 days the previous fall replacing the weakest sections. But she made clear she was aware of the perimeter and was forming views about it. She refused to graze with the goats, which Mabel had expected might be a problem. The goats, for their part, regarded Clover with the barely concealed hostility that goats regard most intrusions. There was a standoff near the water trough on day 2 that Mabel watched from the barn doorway, ready to intervene, but which eventually resolved itself in the way these things always did, with everybody moving apart and pretending the confrontation hadn't happened. What Mabel noticed, watching Clover move through those first days, was that the cow was not random. That was the thing that stuck with her. Everything Clover did had a quality of intention to it. When she moved to a new section of pasture, she didn't wander there. She went there. She would stand for a while, nose working, and then move with purpose to wherever she decided was worth her time. She preferred the northeast corner, where the elm threw shade through most of the afternoon, and where, Mabel realized when she went to look, there was a particular mix of plants growing that the rest of the pasture didn't have. Some wild clover, obviously, which felt appropriate, and thin shoots of something she identified later from her father's old botany pamphlet as wild bergamot. She was also, Mabel noticed, drinking differently than the goats. The goats went to the trough when they were thirsty, drank, left. Clover made her way down to the low spot at the south end of the pasture where a seep came up through the ground after rain and collected in a shallow depression before draining off. The water there was cooler than the trough, fed from underground. She found it on her third day. Mabel thought about that. The first real milk she got from Clover was on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the cow arrived. It was less milk than she'd expected. Clover was not, by any measurement, a prodigious producer. But what came out of her was different, thicker. The cream rose fast and rode high in the pail, nearly a quarter of the total volume. Mabel stood in the barn with the morning light coming through the gaps in the siding and tilted the pail and watched the cream move and thought, "That's not normal." She tasted it, rich, clean, with something underneath she couldn't quite name. Faintly herbal, almost sweet, not in a cloying way but in the way that good things sometimes are. She made butter that afternoon. She had a small churn, old and needing the lid handle replaced, that she'd used occasionally to process whatever surplus the goats gave her. The butter from goat milk was fine, useful, nothing she'd ever given a second thought to. This butter was different. It came together quickly, firmer than she expected, with a yellow that was almost gold. She pressed it into the mold her mother had left her, a simple wooden rectangle, nothing fancy, and tasted a corner off the knife. She stood very still. Then she wrapped it and set it in the coolest corner of the pantry and went out to look at Clover, who was in the elm corner eating bergamot shoots in her deliberate, considering way. The first person she told was her nearest neighbor, a widow named Ruth Blanton, who lived 3/4 of a mile south, and who had been one of the few people in the surrounding community to treat Mabel's situation with something approaching practical respect rather than theatrical sympathy. Ruth was 62, sharp-eyed, and had run her own place alone for 11 years since her husband's accident, which gave her opinions on the subject of women managing land that carried more weight than most. "Come try something," Mabel said when Ruth answered the door Saturday evening. Ruth came. She sat at Mabel's table, and Mabel cut her a piece of bread and put the butter in front of her, and Ruth spread it the way she spread everything, carefully, evenly, no waste. She took a bite, chewed, set the bread down. "Where did you get this butter?" Ruth said. "Made it myself, this afternoon." Ruth looked at her. "From what?" "The cow I got from Dale Whitmore, the spotted one he was threatening to slaughter." Ruth picked up the bread again and took another bite. She ate the whole piece without speaking, which was unusual for Ruth, who generally talked through meals as a matter of habit. "Mabel," she finally said, "this is the best butter I have had in 20 years. Mabel sat down. She hadn't let herself think that word, best, because it felt presumptuous, and she'd learned to be suspicious of her own judgments when she wanted something to be true. Hearing it from Ruth, who had no stake in the matter and no tendency toward flattery, was something different. "I don't know what she's eating," Mabel said. "She picks her own spots. I've been watching her, but I haven't interfered. She goes to the bergamot, she drinks from the seep, she stays in the shade through the hottest part of the day." "And the milk?" "Rich, very high cream. I've never seen anything like it from a cow this size." Ruth was quiet again, turning something over. "You going to sell it?" "I was thinking about the hotel in Gilmore. They go through butter. I know Mrs. Pickering handles the kitchen ordering." "Go to Mrs. Pickering," Ruth said, "and price it honestly. Don't undercut yourself because you're nervous. If it's this quality, it's worth what quality is worth." Gotcha. She went to see Mrs. Pickering on a Tuesday, carrying a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Agnes Pickering managed the kitchen and purchasing for the Gilmore Hotel, a position she'd held for 12 years, in which she treated with the gravity of someone running a considerably more prestigious operation. She was a precise woman, not unkind but without sentimentality about business matters. She accepted the parcel, unwrapped it, cut a thin slice from the corner with a small knife she kept in her apron and tasted it without ceremony. Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, a slight relaxation around the eyes, the particular look of someone who has encountered something unexpected. "You made this yourself," she said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Yes, ma'am." "From your own cow." "My own cow." Mabel's kept her hands still at her sides. "I'm set up to produce regularly. Not a large volume yet, but consistent, and the quality won't vary." "Where did you learn to do this?" "I watched," Mabel said. Which was true, though what she'd watched was the cow rather than any human instructor. Agnes Pickering turned the butter over in her hand, studying it like it was a document she was trying to verify. "I'll take 6 pounds a week to start. If the quality holds, we can discuss more." Mabel did not let herself smile until she was back outside in the street, and even then she kept it small, because there were people watching and she had learned not to give them the satisfaction of seeing too much. The weeks that followed had a quality of concentration to them, the particular intensity of a person who has found a thing that works and is trying to understand it fully before the luck runs out. Every morning, Mabel was up before light, out to the barn, working through the milking with a quietness she'd had to learn. Clover didn't object to being milked, but she had preferences about the process. She liked it slow. She didn't like the stool placed too close. She would shift and fidget if Mabel's hands were cold. These were small adjustments, but they mattered. The mornings when Mabel rushed or came in with her mind already somewhere else were the mornings the milk was harder to get and the yield was lower. She started keeping a notebook. Her father had left her 3 of them, the kind with stiff gray covers and narrow ruled lines that he'd used for recording crop information and weather and the little observations about the land that he'd accumulated over his years here. She used the 3rd one, the one least written in, and began filling it with her own observations. What she ate, where she grazed, how long she stood in which corner at which hour, whether the milk changed with the weather, with the time of month, with what was growing in the pasture. She noted when the wild bergamot was at its peak, late June, fragrant and purple, filling the northeast corner with something that made the whole pasture smell different, and how the milk that week was particularly good, the cream thicker than ever, the butter nearly orange in the mold. She was not a scientist. She would not have called herself that, but she was a careful observer, which turned out to matter more. Frank Greer came to call in July. He came on a Wednesday, unannounced, which was exactly like him, and arrived while she was in the barn doing the midday check on the feed situation. She heard his wagon before she saw him and stepped out into the heat with her hands on her hips before he was all the way through the gate. "Miss Cross," he said. "Mr. Greer." She waited. He climbed down from the wagon with the unhurried ease of a man who was comfortable arriving places uninvited. He was perhaps 45, with a heavy build going soft now, and a careful way of constructing sentences that she'd always found slightly exhausting. "I've been hearing good things," he said, "about your dairy work." "Have you?" "Agnes Pickering mentioned it to my wife, said she'd found a reliable source for butter." He glanced toward the pasture, where Clover was visible in the elm corner. "I didn't know you were running a dairy operation." "It's small," Mabel said. "Growing." He looked at the pasture again. "That the cow you got from Dale Whitmore?" "That's right." "Heard she was trouble. Won't stay in a herd, wanders off." "She does what suits her," Mabel said. "I found it's better to let her." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Interesting approach." He turned back to her and put on an expression she recognized, the careful smile of a man about to make a suggestion that was really an offer, that was really a negotiation. "I've been thinking about the dairy business lately, thinking there might be room for some coordination between operations in the area. Shared resources, maybe. Combined reputation." Mabel looked at him. "I'm fine working independently, Mr. Greer." "Of course. Of course." The smile stayed up. "Just thinking about the future. The trade's competitive. It can be harder than people expect for a smaller operation to stay stable." "I appreciate the thought," she said. "I should get back to work." He left without pushing, which told her he wasn't certain enough yet to push. But she stood at the gate after his wagon disappeared down the lane and held on to the cold feeling at the back of her chest that his visits always left behind. She went back to the barn, sat down on the old stool in the corner, and wrote in her notebook. F. Greer visited. Has heard about the butter. Watching. Keep records. She had started keeping records of everything. The sales, the yields, the dates. The names of customers and what they'd ordered and whether they'd come back. She'd been doing it out of habit, the same instinct for documentation her father had, but sitting there after Greer left, she understood it for what it was. She was building proof, the record of a real operation, legitimate and steady, that could stand examination. Twat. By August, she had 8 regular customers. Agnes Pickering remained the largest, now taking 10 pounds of butter per week, and twice she'd asked about cheese, which Mabel had been thinking about but hadn't attempted yet. There were 3 households in Gilmore who sent someone out to the farm to purchase directly. There was a boarding house in Clayfield, 12 miles east, that her butter had reached through Ruth Blanton's recommendation. And there were 2 ranching families who had tried her products almost as a challenge. Let's see what this woman thinks she's selling. And come back the following week without the challenging expressions. The money was not yet comfortable. Comfortable was a long way off. But it was real money, regular money, and it was hers. She began to think about a second cow. Not to replace Clover. That wasn't even a consideration. But to grow. If Clover's methods could be applied to other animals, if the attention and the adapted care could produce similar results in a different temperament, then what she had wasn't a lucky accident. It was a practice. She didn't say this to anyone. The idea was too fragile yet, and she'd learned that fragile ideas had a way of getting crushed by the boots of other people's certainty. What she hadn't prepared for was how much the success would cost her in other ways. The summer heat had been brutal, running through August without a break, and the work was unrelenting in a way that didn't leave room for much else. She had not slept a full night since spring. Her hands were rough enough now that she caught them on things without realizing. Fabric, her own hair, the pages of her notebook. She'd lost weight she hadn't had to lose. There were mornings, not many, but some, when she woke before light and lay in the heat of the small house and thought about how far she was from anyone. Not lonely, exactly. Loneliness was something you felt in company. This was simpler and harder than that. It was the particular exhaustion of carrying every decision yourself, every risk, every consequence, with no one to check your thinking against except a widow who lived 3/4 of a mile south and a notebook that couldn't push back. She thought about her father on those mornings. Not with sentiment. She had never been a sentimental person, and grief had come and gone through her in December like a weather system, hard and fast, but with a plain sort of missing. He had been a specific man with a specific way of working through problems. He talked to himself in the garden, not praying, just thinking out loud. Now, here's what we've got. Here's what we can do with it. That voice. She missed the sound of that voice working through things. She got up on those mornings and went out to the barn and put her hand on Clover's side, standing in the dark with the old horse dozing in his stall and the goats muttering, and let herself feel the warmth of the animal's flank until she was ready to start the day. It wasn't comfort in any grand sense. It was just what she had, and she'd gotten good at knowing the difference between what was enough and what was everything. On a September evening, after the day's work was done and the light was going flat and orange across the pasture, Mabel sat on the fence rail and watched Clover make her slow circuit of the elm corner. The cow paused in the middle of her grazing and turned to look at her. That same deliberate look, watchful, considering. "You're going to be trouble," Mabel said, out loud to the cow. Clover switched her tail once and returned to her bergamot. Mabel looked out across the pasture, the rough grass, the thistle she'd never quite beaten back, the seep glinting faintly in the last light where the ground went wet, and thought, small. It's small, but it's real. The notebook was filling up. The customers were coming back. The butter in the cellar was waiting for Tuesday's delivery run. She was not comfortable. She was not safe. The winter was coming, and she had no illusions about what it would take. But the cow nobody wanted was in the elm corner eating the plants she'd chosen herself. And the milk was good, and for now that was something to work with. She climbed down from the fence and went in to start supper. The first frost came early that year, dropping down out of the north on a mid-October night without much warning. Just a drop in the air around sundown that Mabel recognized in a sky that went too clear too fast. She was up at 3 a.m, covering the last of the kitchen garden with burlap, working by lantern light with her breath showing, and by the time she got back inside, her fingers were stiff enough that she had trouble with the door latch. She stood in the kitchen warming her hands over the stove and thought about the second cow she'd been considering since August. Winter was the wrong time to bring a new animal in. She knew that. Feed costs went up, adjustment periods were harder on everyone, and she didn't have the barn space she'd need without some modification to the south stall. But the thought kept returning, the way practical thoughts did when they were actually right, persistently, without drama, just sitting there waiting to be acted on. She wrote it in the notebook, second cow, spring. Look at what's available after calving season. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed and slept 4 hours, which was about what she was averaging. The winter settled in and the work contracted the way it always did. Less growing, more maintaining. She kept the dairy going through the cold months by managing Clover's feed with a care that bordered on obsession. She'd read everything she could find about feed quality and milk production, which wasn't much. The agricultural pamphlets that came through the Gilmore post office were written for large operations, cattle ranches, men with hired hands. But she pulled out what was useful and adapted the rest. She ordered a small quantity of dried bergamot from a herb dealer in Salina, on the theory that if Clover sought it out in summer, it was doing something, and mixed it into the winter feed in small amounts. The milk didn't drop the way she'd feared. It changed. Slightly less in volume, the cream a touch thinner, but it stayed good, noticeably good, in a way that kept her customers coming back through weather that kept most people close to home. Agnes Pickering sent a note in November. The quality holds, considering an arrangement for cheese in the new year. Come see me when the road's clear. Mabel read the note 3 times standing at the door, and then put it carefully in the back of the notebook. Home. She went to see Agnes Pickering in February, on a day when the roads were passable, but the sky had the look of a man deciding whether to throw a punch. She wore her good coat, which was not very good, and arrived at the hotel kitchen door rather than the front entrance, because she understood by now which entrances people expected her to use and which ones were worth fighting over, and the kitchen door was not one of them. Agnes received her at the long work table where she did her ordering, a ledger open in front of her, and a pen in her hand that she set down but kept nearby, which was a particular kind of signal. "The butter arrangement has worked well," Agnes said. "I've had guests comment on it, which doesn't happen often. People don't generally think about butter." "They notice when it's different," Mabel said. "Exactly." Agnes looked at her steadily. "I want to discuss a longer arrangement, including hard cheese, if you can produce it to the same standard. I'm working on it." This was true. She'd been practicing cheese through the winter months, small batches, learning the process by failure as much as anything else. A wheel that didn't press right, a rind that developed wrong. 2 batches she'd thrown out rather than sell something she wasn't sure about. The 3rd batch had been right. She knew it when she cut into it. "I'll need to taste it before I commit," Agnes said. "I'd expect that." Agnes leaned back slightly. She was a woman who kept herself at a precise professional distance from the people she dealt with, and Mabel had respect for that. It was a practice she understood, the calculation of how much warmth was safe to extend in a business context when you were a woman conducting business. "You're running this alone," Agnes said. It wasn't quite a question. "For now. That's going to become a limitation." "I know it," Mabel said. "I'm thinking about it." Agnes looked at her for a moment with something that was not sympathy. Sympathy wasn't in her repertoire as far as Mabel could tell, but was perhaps acknowledgement. One careful woman to another. "Bring me the cheese when it's ready," she said, and picked up her pen again. Spring came reluctantly, the way Kansas spring always did, arguing with itself for 6 weeks before finally committing. The mud season was bad that year. 2 wet weeks in March that made the lane nearly impassable and kept her from the Tuesday delivery run twice, which she made up for by going on Thursday instead and adding a small discount she could barely afford, because she'd rather lose a little margin than lose a customer who'd found someone else to fill the gap. That was the constant arithmetic of it. The edge she operated on was narrow enough that she felt every shift. A week of bad milk, which happened twice, for reasons she tracked back to changes in Clover's grazing habits when the ground was waterlogged and the pasture plants were stressed, cost her more than money. It cost her the confidence she'd built, which had to be rebuilt, which took time and consistency she was already stretched to provide. She wasn't sleeping enough. She knew it because her thinking went ragged at the edges in the late afternoons, the way it had once when she'd had a fever. the slightly blurred quality of a mind working on less than it needed. She made herself stop working at 9 at night no matter where she was in the task list, which meant some things didn't get done, which kept a low-grade anxiety running underneath everything. She still watched Clover every day. That hadn't changed. If anything, she watched more carefully now because she'd come to understand that the cow was teaching her something that she wasn't finished learning yet. Clover's patterns had become legible to her over the winter. The preference for south-facing slopes when the ground was cold, because the sun hit there first and dried the damp out of the grass. The return to the seep every third day regardless of weather. The way she would stand completely still for minutes at a time in the late morning, not grazing, just existing, and then resume as if whatever she'd been working through had resolved itself. Mabel had started doing something she wouldn't have admitted to anyone, which was pausing in the same spots Clover paused and trying to notice what the animal noticed. It felt faintly ridiculous. It was also, she was increasingly convinced, the most useful thing she did all day. Standing in the northeast corner on a still April morning, she realized she could smell the difference between the soil there and the soil 20 feet away. Something mineral and clean from the underground water coming up through the roots of the plants. The grass there was finer and greener, and it came up earlier in the spring than the rest of the pasture by nearly 2 weeks. She marked it in the notebook and then expanded it. She fenced a smaller area within the larger pasture, directing Clover's rotation deliberately through the different zones, keeping track of what the cow ate and when. She began to see a cycle, not a rigid one, not the kind you could set a clock to, but a rhythm that Clover returned to with a consistency that couldn't be coincidence. The animal was managing her own nutrition. Had been, probably, all along. The idea that came from this was simple and strange, and she turned it over for 2 weeks before she trusted it enough to act on it. If she could replicate the conditions Clover had found, the shade, the cool water, the specific mix of plants, in other parts of the pasture, she could potentially extend the same quality to a second animal. She was not managing a cow. She was managing an environment. She wrote that down. She underlined it twice. The second cow arrived in May. Her name, as far as the man she came from was concerned, was Number 14, which told you everything you needed to know about how that man thought about his animals. She was a brown and white shorthorn with a placid face and a history of low milk production that had convinced her previous owner she was barely worth the feed she consumed. He sold her to Mabel for less than he'd paid for her 2 years earlier, and he did it with the faint condescension of someone doing you a favor. Mabel brought her home in the early morning and put her in the east section of the pasture, which she'd spent 3 weeks preparing. The grass managed low and varied, a water source cleared and deepened, a stand of wild herbs encouraged along the fence line. She stood at the gate and watched Number 14 move into the new space. The cow stopped just inside the fence and stood very still, ears forward, processing. Then slowly she began to move. Not wandering, moving. She went directly to the water first, which was what a tired, stressed animal did. She drank for a long time. Then she moved north toward the herbs and put her nose down. Mabel let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She named her Hazel. It took 3 weeks for Hazel to settle, and in that time her milk was mediocre. Thin, low cream, the product of an animal under stress in a new place, which was expected and which Mabel had planned for by keeping her own reserves up. She did not rush the animal, did not push her into a routine, watched, recorded, waited. The change, when it came, was gradual enough that she almost missed it. The cream line in the pail rose a little, then a little more. The color deepened from pale to gold. The smell changed, that clean, faintly herbal quality she recognized from Clover's best milk. By the end of June, Hazel was producing milk that was not the same as Clover's. It never would be. They were different animals with different natures, but was genuinely exceptional by any standard Mabel had known before. She stood in the barn on a Tuesday morning with both pails in front of her and felt something she didn't entirely have a word for. Not pride exactly, something more specific. The satisfaction of a theory proved. It wasn't luck. It wasn't Clover. It was the method. Ruth Blanton came by on a Thursday in July and found Mabel in the barn doing the midday accounting, which she did now on a proper ledger she'd bought from the general store, rather than in the margins of the notebook. Ruth looked around at the 2 cows, the organized feed storage, The small cheese press Mabel had built herself from salvaged lumber over the winter, and she stood in the barn doorway for a moment before she said anything. "You've been busy," Ruth said. "Some." Ruth came in and sat on the stool Mabel kept near the door for visitors, which was also the stool she milked from when her back was acting up. "Frank Greer's been talking." Mabel kept her eyes on the ledger. "About what?" "About you. About your operation." Ruth paused. "He's been telling people your butter is good because of the cow, not because of anything you're doing. That you just got lucky with an unusual animal and it won't last." Mabel wrote down a number. "What do people say when he says that?" "Some of them agree with him. Some of them don't. Agnes Pickering doesn't, from what I hear. She's been recommending you to people without being asked." Ruth looked at the cheese press. "Is that what I think it is?" "First wheels are ready next week. I've got a buyer in Clayfield who wants to try them." Ruth made a sound that was as close to impressed as she allowed herself. "He's not going to like that," she said, meaning Greer. "No," Mabel agreed. "He's not." She finished the number she was writing and looked up. She was tired in a way that had become so constant she'd almost stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that was always there. Her hands had calluses on them now that didn't go away between seasons. She had a knot in her left shoulder from the churning work that she managed with heat and stretching and occasional bad language when no one was around. "I need help," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud to anyone, and it came out more straightforwardly than she'd expected, without the reluctance she'd been carrying around the thought. Ruth looked at her steadily. "What kind of help?" "Someone who can work." "Not a hand." "I can't pay a hand's wage, not yet. Someone starting out who wants to learn, who I can teach what I know and pay in kind and a small wage until the income grows enough to make it proper." She paused. "Someone who won't think they already know better than me." Ruth was quiet for a moment, then, "I know a girl named Sadie Turner. She's 19. She's been working at the boarding house in Clayfield since her family's place folded last fall. She's sharp, she works without being told twice, and she's in a situation that isn't going anywhere good if she stays in it." Ruth looked at her directly. "She deserves a better hand than she's been dealt." Mabel thought about that, about a 19-year-old who'd watched her family's place fail, about what it meant to need a chance that wasn't coming from anywhere obvious. "Can she come out this week?" she said. "I'll write to her today. Doug." Sadie Turner arrived on a Saturday morning, on the back of a wagon driven by a man from Clayfield who had business in Gilmore and had agreed to drop her at the lane turnoff for the price of a pound of butter, which Mabel provided without complaint. She was small, smaller than Mabel had expected from Ruth's description, with dark hair pinned up under a hat that had seen better times and a face that was younger than her eyes. She carried a bag that wasn't heavy enough to hold much, and she stood at the end of the lane with her chin up in the particular way of someone who had decided they were not going to let the uncertainty show if they could help it. Mabel walked down to meet her. "Sadie Turner." "Miss Cross." The girl's handshake was firm, nervous, but firm. "Come see the place," Mabel said, and turned up the lane without ceremony. She showed her the barn first, Clover and Hazel both watching the newcomer with bovine assessment, Clover from her corner with the particular quality of calm judgment that she brought to most things. She showed her the cheese press, the churn, the cold cellar where the finished products waited. She showed her the notebook. "I write everything down," Mabel said, "what works and what doesn't. I expect you to do the same once you know what you're looking at." Sadie looked at the notebook pages, dense with observations, dates, measurements, small sketches of the pasture zones. "I can read and write," she said. "I want you to know that up front. Some people assume." "I'm not assuming anything," Mabel said, "except that you're here and willing to work, which is more than I knew this morning." Something in the girl's posture shifted, not relaxed exactly, but recalibrated, like she'd been braced for something that hadn't come. "The pay is small," Mabel said. "I'll be straight with you. It's going to be small for a while. You'll have room and board, and I'll teach you every part of what I do here. And when the income grows, the wage grows with it. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a share in something I'm building, if you're willing to help build it." Sadie looked out at the pasture where Clover was making her afternoon circuit of the elm corner with her characteristic unhurried deliberateness. "What's wrong with that one?" she said. "Why does she go to the same spot every day?" "Nothing's wrong with her," Mabel said. She knows something about that corner. I've been learning what it is. She paused. That's going to be a lot of what you do here, learning to pay attention before you act. It goes against most of what people teach you about working with animals. Sadie was quiet for a moment, still watching Clover. My father never paid attention, she said, not bitterly, just flatly, the way you stated a fact that you'd already finished grieving. He worked hard, harder than anybody I know, but he never paid attention to what the land was telling him, just did what his father did. She looked back at Mabel. That's why we lost the place. Mabel looked at her. A 19-year-old who had already learned the hardest lesson and who was standing on someone else's lane with a light bag and her chin up, trying to build something out of whatever was left. All right, Mabel said. Let me show you how we do the milking. What? The first weeks with Sadie were not seamless. Nothing was. Sadie was quick and willing, but she had the habits of a person who'd worked in institutional kitchens. She moved fast, she was efficient, she got things done in the most direct line between 2 points, which was useful for most things, and wrong for the dairy work, where fast and direct were exactly what the animals didn't respond to. Clover, in particular, made her feelings known. She shifted and stamped when Sadie came too quickly into her space. She held back milk twice in the first week, which cost them both, and Mabel had to explain, had to find the words for something she'd understood for months without having had to articulate it. She's not being difficult, Mabel said, standing outside the stall while Sadie tried to collect herself after the second failed milking. She's responding to you, the speed of you, the tension in your hands. She can feel it. I'm not tense, Sadie said, and her jaw was tight when she said it. Mabel looked at her. Yes, you are. You're worried about getting it right, which means you're carrying that into the stall with you, and she knows. Sadie was quiet for a moment. How do you stop worrying about getting it right? You don't stop worrying. You put it somewhere else while you're in the stall. You think about something that has nothing to do with milk production. Mabel paused. What do you think about when you're not working? Sadie looked at her like it was an odd question. I don't know. My sister's kids, maybe. They're back in Salina with my mother. Think about them, Mabel said. Next time you go in, think about your sister's kids and go slow and let your hands warm up before you start. See what happens. Sadie looked skeptical, the way a practical person looked skeptical about something that sounded like nonsense. But she did it. The next morning, she went into Clover's stall thinking about 2 children in Salina she probably missed more than she said, and her hands were warmer and her shoulders were lower, and Clover stood still and gave her everything she had. Sadie came out of the stall with a full pail and an expression on her face that Mabel recognized because she'd worn it herself. The particular look of someone who has learned something that shifts the ground slightly under their feet. That's stupid, Sadie said. That shouldn't work. No, Mabel agreed. It shouldn't. They stood there in the early morning, the milk warm in the pail between them, and both of them laughing a little, which was something Mabel hadn't done in the barn before, and which felt, she thought, like the beginning of something. The cheese reached Clayfield in the first week of August, wrapped in cloth, and packed in a wooden crate that Mabel had built herself from scrap lumber, because the crates available at the general store were the wrong size, and she wasn't going to compromise the product for the sake of convenience. The buyer was a man named Howard Vess, who ran the largest boarding house in Clayfield, and who had contacted her through Ruth Blanton's network of quiet recommendations. He was a careful man about money, the kind who counted change twice, not from suspicion, but from habit. And he tasted the cheese the way Agnes Pickering had tasted the butter, without expression, taking his time. He ordered 12 pounds to start. He wanted monthly delivery if the quality held. Driving home from Clayfield with an empty crate and a signed order in her coat pocket, Mabel felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. It wasn't relief exactly. It was the specific feeling of a thing that had been theoretical becoming actual. The dairy wasn't a homestead side project anymore. It was becoming what she'd been building toward without letting herself say the word directly. Sadie was waiting at the barn when she got back because Sadie was always at the barn, which was something Mabel had noticed and not taken for granted. The girl had a quality of presence, a willingness to simply be where the work was, that reminded Mabel of her father in his best years. Not asking what needed doing, just already doing it. How'd it go? Sadie asked. You took 12 pounds, monthly. Sadie's face did something careful and pleased. That's good. That's real, Mabel said, which was more accurate. Some. By September, the operation had a shape that Mabel could look at from the outside and recognize as something. 2 cows, both producing well. A cheese output of 20 pounds per month between the 2 Clayfield and Gilmore accounts. The butter trade steady enough that she'd extended delivery to a third settlement, a growing community called Harker's Crossing, 15 miles north, where a general store owner named Pritchard had heard about her products through Agnes Pickering and written to inquire. She and Sadie had settled into a rhythm that had taken 6 weeks to find and which they both understood without having to discuss it much. Mornings were milking and the early barn work. Middays were processing, churning, pressing, the careful temperature management of the aging wheels. Afternoons were the tasks that had no fixed schedule: fence checking, pasture management, feed assessment, the 1,000 small maintenance jobs that a working farm generated continuously, like a slow leak. Sadie had turned out to be good at things Mabel hadn't expected, and not yet good at things Mabel had. She was excellent with the cheese press. She had a feel for the pressure that Mabel had taken months to develop, and Sadie had found in weeks a gift for the physical intuition of the thing. She was less patient with observation. She still moved a little fast, thought a little quickly, wanted to act before she'd finished watching. Mabel corrected her on it regularly, not harshly but consistently, the way you corrected anything that mattered. "You watched Clover for 4 months before you changed anything," Sadie said one afternoon, when Mabel stopped her from adjusting Hazel's grazing rotation before she'd finished tracking the current pattern. "I've been watching for 3 weeks. Clover had 4 months because I didn't have another choice," Mabel said. "I'm telling you to wait because you do." Sadie looked at her with an expression that was not quite disagreement, but was adjacent to it. "You're impatient," Mabel said, not unkindly. "That's not a character flaw. It's just a thing you're going to have to work against here because this operation runs on paying attention before acting." Sadie was quiet. Then, "My father was impatient too." "I know," Mabel said. "You told me." "I don't want to be like him." "You're not like him, but you've got one of the same habits." Mabel picked up the fence post she'd been holding and went back to the repair. "The good news is habits can be changed. The bad news is it takes longer than 3 weeks." Sadie picked up the mallet without being asked and handed it over. "How long did it take you?" Mabel thought about that honestly because she owed the girl honesty more than she owed her a comfortable answer. "I'm still working on it," she said. Frank Greer showed up again in October. She'd known he would. The Clayfield order had traveled back through the same network of talk that everything traveled through in this part of Kansas, and by now the Cross Creek Dairy, which was what people had started calling it, a name she hadn't given it herself but had stopped correcting, had enough of a reputation that ignoring it required deliberate effort. Frank was not a man who ignored things that made him uncomfortable. He came on a Wednesday afternoon, which was her processing day, and this time he brought someone with him, a man Mabel didn't recognize, younger than Greer, well-dressed in the way that meant city money rather than frontier money, with clean boots that had never seen a barn floor. Sadie was inside with the afternoon's pressing. Mabel was at the fence line replacing a section of wire that had gone slack, and she straightened up when she heard the wagon. "Miss Cross," Frank said, climbing down. "Hope we're not interrupting." "You are," she said pleasantly. "But go ahead." If the directness bothered him, he didn't show it. He gestured to the man with him. "This is Mr. Aldrich. He represents a purchasing concern out of Wichita. They source dairy products for distribution, hotels, restaurants, that sort of thing." Mabel looked at Aldrich. He had the careful, assessing quality of a man who moved through the world, making calculations, and had gotten comfortable with it. "Miss Cross," he said, "I've heard good things about your products." "From Mr. Greer?" she said. "From several sources." He smiled, which told her nothing. "I was hoping to discuss a purchasing arrangement." She looked between the two of them, Greer with his too careful expression, Aldrich with his city boots and his neutral smile, and understood the shape of it immediately. Greer had brought him, which meant Greer had a stake in whatever was being offered, which meant this was not purely in her interest, regardless of how it was framed. "I'm happy to discuss it," she said. "Come back on a Friday. I don't do business conversations on processing days." Aldrich blinked. Greer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course," Aldrich said, smooth enough that she almost believed he'd expected it. "Friday, then." She watched them drive away and stood at the fence with the wire stretcher in her hand for a moment before she went back to work. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not quite. There was a low, alert hum running underneath her, thinking that she recognized as the particular state she entered when something required careful management. She went inside and told Sadie. "What does Greer get out of it?" Sadie asked immediately. Mabel looked at her. "That's exactly the right question." "So what does he get?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out before Friday." Yet Ruth Blanton knew because Ruth always knew things. Or rather, Ruth knew people, and people knew things. And Ruth had the patience and social intelligence to sit with those people long enough that things found their way to the surface. Mabel rode to Ruth's place that evening, in the last of the light, and laid out what had happened. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. When Mabel finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee, and then she said, "Greer's been talking to some of the suppliers in Wichita. He wants to set up a collective, several dairy operations under one distribution arrangement. He'd be the coordinating party." "Meaning he'd control the pricing," Mabel said. "And the buyer relationships, yes." Ruth set down her cup. "He's been putting this together for a while. He needs your product to make the collection worth a Wichita buyer's attention. His own butter isn't good enough to anchor it alone, and he knows it." Mabel sat with that. The precise calculation of it, the way Greer had watched her operation grow and understood exactly what it represented, and moved to position himself between her and the larger market before she got there herself. "If I sign on to his arrangement," she said, "he sets the prices and I lose direct buyer relationships. That would be my guess at the terms. And if I don't sign on, he'll make it harder for me to reach the Wichita market independently." "He'll try," Ruth said carefully. Mabel looked at the window. Outside it was full dark now, the Kansas night absolute in a way that city people never quite believed until they experienced it. "I'm not signing anything," she said. "I didn't think you would," Ruth said. "But be careful how you refuse. He's got friends in Gilmore that I don't need to name." She refused Aldrich on Friday with a politeness so thorough it couldn't be argued with. She wasn't ready to expand distribution. She was focused on quality consistency. She hoped to be in a position to discuss it at a future date. Aldrich accepted the refusal with the professional smoothness of a man who had received many refusals and knew when to push and when to withdraw. Greer sat beside him and said very little, which was worse than if he'd argued. After they left, Sadie was at the barn door. "Well?" "I said no." "How'd Greer take it?" "Quietly." Mabel looked at the lane. "That's what worries me." November came in cold and sharp, and the work intensified the way it always did at the edge of winter, the particular urgency of getting everything secured and stocked and ready before the serious weather arrived. She and Sadie worked long days without discussing it much. It was simply what the season demanded, and both of them understood that. The fence cut happened on a Tuesday night in the second week of November. Mabel found it Wednesday morning on her early pasture check. A section of the east boundary. 30 feet of wire, clean cuts. Not a break, but a deliberate severance at 4 points along the line. The wire laid down into the grass on both sides. Clover and hazel were still inside the perimeter, which was only luck, or, in Clover's case, perhaps deliberate choice. Clover stood near the gap and looked at it with her usual judicial quality, as if she'd assessed the situation and decided it wasn't worth walking through. Mabel stood at the cut fence in the gray morning light and felt the cold settle into her more deeply than the temperature accounted for. She made herself look at it clearly, without the layer of fear that wanted to rush in. Someone had come onto her property at night. Someone with wire cutters and intent. Someone who had been watching her fence line carefully enough to know which section to cut. She went and got Sadie. Sadie came out in her coat half-buttoned and looked at the fence and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "This wasn't an accident." "No." "Who?" "I don't know." She did know, or thought she knew, which wasn't the same thing and couldn't be treated as the same thing. "I need you to stay with the animals while I go to town." "You should tell the sheriff." "I'm going to." She paused. "I'm also going to document this first." She went and got the notebook. She sketched the fence line, marking the 4 cut points, measuring the distances between them with paced steps, writing down everything about the ground, the frost in the grass, the lack of footprints that told her whoever had done this was careful, the direction the cut wire had fallen. She was not trying to do the sheriff's job. She was creating a record that existed independent of whatever the sheriff did or didn't do with the information. She had learned to make records. This was why. Sheriff Amos Deld was a man of 50 who had held the position in Gilmore County for 11 years and who administered it with the particular economy of effort that came from long experience and the understanding that most things resolved themselves eventually if you didn't make them worse. He was not a bad man. He was also not a man who was going to be energized by a fence-cut complaint from a woman homesteader when he had no witness and no physical evidence of who had done it. He came out that afternoon, looked at the fence, listened to what she told him, and wrote things in his own small notebook with the careful neutrality of a man making sure he couldn't be accused of not responding. "Any idea who might have done this?" he said, which was the question that meant, "Do you have an accusation? And if so, how much trouble is it going to cause me?" "I have a thought," Mabel said. "I won't say it without more than a thought." He nodded slowly, which told her they understood each other. "I'll ask around. These things are hard to prove." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to prove anything. I'm asking you to know it happened." He looked at her. "Noted," he said, and that was as much as she was going to get. After he left, she stood at the repaired fence. She and Sadie had spent 2 hours putting it right and felt the cold anger that had been sitting underneath everything since morning shift into something harder and more useful. Not rage. She couldn't afford rage. Rage was expensive and imprecise, and it had never fixed a fence. What she felt instead was determination, the kind that had a specific quality to it, like a piece of metal that's been through heat and is now harder than it was before. She increased the fence checks to twice daily. She moved the most critical supply records, the buyer contracts, the production logs, the accounts ledger, to a tin box she kept under the floorboards in the house, which was not secure from a determined person, but was secure from a casual one. She wrote to Agnes Pickering and Howard Vest directly, informing them that delivery would continue uninterrupted, which was both true and a signal. She was still here, the operation was intact, whatever anyone had hoped to accomplish hadn't worked. Sadie found her at the desk one evening, writing those letters, and sat down across from her without asking. "You think it was Greer," Sadie said. "I think it's possible." "You think it was Greer," Sadie repeated, which was not a question. Mabel set down her pen. "What I think and what I can demonstrate are two different things. I've been careful about that. Being careful about it doesn't change what happened. No, but being careful about it changes what I can do next." She picked up the pen again. "The best answer to this isn't to accuse him. The best answer is to make the operation strong enough that cutting my fence doesn't matter, that I'm too established to be stopped by one bad night." Sadie was quiet. She had the look she sometimes got, not quite convinced, but processing. "And if he does something worse, then I'll have records," Mabel said. "Every day, everything. He can cut my fence once. He can't cut my documentation." What she hadn't expected was the community. It started with Ruth, which made sense. Ruth came out the Thursday after the fence incident with a jar of preserved plums and a look that meant she'd been thinking. "People are talking," she said, "about the fence." "Word got out," Mabel said flatly. "Word gets out. It's the nature of things." Ruth set the plums on the table. "But the talk isn't going the way you might think. Most people, not all, but most, aren't pleased about it." Mabel looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that cutting a woman's fence at night is a particular kind of cowardly, and people in this county know what cowardly looks like, and they don't like it." Ruth sat down without being asked, because Ruth never waited to be asked. "Agnes Pickering has been letting it be known that she intends to continue her arrangement with you, loudly when relevant." Mabel sat with that for a moment. "There's also a family named Howarth," Ruth continued, "out past the Greer boundary. Their boy, he's maybe 17, came around to see if you needed help with fence repair. His mother sent him." Mabel didn't say anything immediately because there was something working in her chest that she didn't want to show while Ruth was watching. She was a private person about the things that affected her, and she'd been alone long enough that expressions of solidarity still hit her slightly off-center, like sound coming from an unexpected direction. "I didn't need the help," she finally said. "Sadie and I had it repaired the same day." "I know, but the fact that he came matters." It did. She understood that. The gesture wasn't about the fence. It was about who was watching and what they thought they saw. A woman who'd built something real, and someone trying to tear it down at night, and people who had opinions about which of those things deserved their support. Frank Greer could cut her wire. He couldn't cut that. She ran into Greer 2 weeks later at the general store in Gilmore, which was unavoidable. The store was small, and the county was not large, and their supply needs overlapped enough that crossing paths was a matter of when, not if. He was at the counter when she came in. He turned when the door opened and saw her and did the thing that told her everything she needed to know about his state of mind. His eyes went to the space just past her shoulder instead of to her face, the look of a man who is not certain he can maintain his expression under direct examination. "Miss Cross," he said. "Mr. Greer." She went to the shelf she needed and took what she came for and brought it to the counter without varying her pace. Martin Hale, who ran the store, had the careful attentiveness of a man witnessing something he wasn't sure about and didn't want to make worse. Greer said, from behind her, "Heard you had some trouble with your fence last month." She turned around and looked at him directly. "I did. Someone cut it, deliberately." She held his gaze. "I've documented it thoroughly." His expression didn't change. "Terrible thing," he said. "Vandalism. A lot of that going around." She turned back to the counter. "Put it on my account, please, Martin." She left without another word and drove home in the thin winter light with her hand steady on the reins and her mind running over the exchange the way you ran over ground after walking it, checking for what you might have missed. He'd known the fence was cut, which meant he knew, but knowing was still not proving, and she had not come to the store to prove anything. She'd come to let him see that she wasn't afraid, that the fence had been repaired, that she was still here buying supplies and running accounts and conducting business like a person who intended to continue doing those things indefinitely. That was the message. She delivered it. December brought the first hard freeze, and with it, a quiet that settled over the farm like a hand pressing down. The days shortened until the dark ate most of them, and she and Sadie worked in lamplight at both ends of the day, the yellow glow of the barn lantern the center of everything. Clover had come through the year differently than she'd expected. She'd expected the animal to age the way working animals aged, gradually, imperceptibly, until you noticed one day that something had changed. But Clover at 2 years on the homestead had a quality that Mabel could only describe as settled, not slow. Her eyes were still alert, her choices still deliberate, but at peace with the place in a way that showed in the quality of her milk, even through the short cold days, a consistency that the notebook documented, but that Mabel also simply knew without looking at the numbers. She sat in the barn on a December evening, the last one before the Christmas week, with the lantern burning and both cows in their stalls and Sadie gone inside to start supper, and she opened the notebook to the first pages. The early entries from the spring before Sadie arrived, from the winter before Hazel, from the first days Clover was on the property. She read them through in the lamplight, her own handwriting, younger somehow, even though it was barely 2 years old, carrying the anxiety of that time in the careful way she'd written down everything, like she was afraid of losing it. She thought about the fence, about Greer in the store, about Agnes Pickering speaking loudly on her behalf without being asked, about a 17-year-old boy sent by his mother to see if she needed help. She thought about Sadie Turner, who had arrived with a light bag and a chin held up against uncertainty, and who was now in Mabel's kitchen starting supper like she had always been there. She closed the notebook and sat with the quiet of the barn and the warmth of the animals, and the particular knowledge that the operation was intact. Not comfortable, not safe in any permanent way, but intact and growing, held together by 2 years of patience and documentation and the refusal to be moved. Outside, the Kansas wind pushed at the barn walls the way it always did in December, looking for weaknesses. She had spent 2 years finding the weaknesses before the wind did and reinforcing them. She was going to keep doing that. She picked up the lantern and went inside to supper. The new year came in without ceremony, the way years did on the frontier. The calendar changed and the work didn't, And the only difference between December 31st and January 1st was that Mabel wrote a new date in the notebook and felt, briefly, the weight of everything the previous year had held before setting it down and moving forward. She had made a decision over the Christmas week, sitting with the account ledger on the evenings when the weather kept her inside. The numbers were not comfortable. They were never comfortable, but they had a shape now that she could work with. The Clayfield account had doubled. Agnes Pickering had extended the hotel arrangement through the following year with a signed letter that Mabel kept in the tin box under the floorboards alongside the buyer contracts and the fence documentation. The Harker's Crossing order from Pritchard's General Store had grown steadily enough that she was now delivering twice monthly instead of once. The decision she'd made was a third cow. She told Sadie on a January morning while they were doing the early milking, because that was where most of their real conversations happened. Not at the table, not in the evenings, but in the barn in the first light, hands occupied, eyes elsewhere, which made it easier to say things directly. "Third cow," Mabel said. "Spring. I want to add a second pasture section if I can get the fencing material." Sadie was quiet for a moment, her hand steady on Hazel's flank. "Where are you going to find her?" "I'm going to look for the same kind of animal I found in Clover, something nobody else wants." Sadie glanced at her sideways. "You're going to deliberately look for the difficult ones." "I'm going to look for the ones other people have given up on," Mabel said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "The difficult ones fight you. The ones people give up on, they're usually just particular. They want something specific and they haven't found it yet." She paused. "That's not the same as broken." Sadie turned this over the way she turned things over now, more slowly than when she'd arrived, with more patience for the time it took to think a thing through properly. That change had happened gradually enough that Mabel hadn't been able to mark the exact moment it occurred, which was how the real changes always happened. "You're describing yourself," Sadie said finally. Mabel didn't respond to that directly. She moved the pail and straightened up. "Write to your contacts in Clayfield. Ask if anyone's got animals they're looking to move." The third cow came from a farm 20 miles west in late April, when the ground had finally thawed enough to make the road passable without destroying a wagon. Her name, according to the man she came from, a taciturn widower named Birch, who ran 30 head of beef cattle and had acquired 3 dairy cows as a failed side enterprise, was simply the red one, which told you the level of attachment involved. She was a dark roan with white patches on her chest, and a disposition that Birch described as ornery, and that Mabel recognized within the first 10 minutes as anxious. The animal startled at quick movements, pressed herself against any available wall when approached directly, and had a way of holding very still when she was scared that looked, if you didn't know what you were looking at, exactly like stubbornness. Birch had priced her low because he'd been getting almost nothing from her in milk, and he wanted her gone before she cost him another season of feed. He took Mabel's offer without negotiating, which meant she'd offered more than he expected, which was fine. She understood what she was getting. The drive home took most of the day, Sadie handling the wagon while Mabel walked alongside the roan on a lead rope, keeping her pace slow and her voice low and saying nothing in particular, just a steady, quiet presence at the animal's shoulder. The roan shied twice at nothing visible and once at a crow that flew up from the roadside grass, and each time Mabel stopped walking and waited until the animal's breathing settled before moving again. They arrived at the homestead in the late afternoon, the light going golden across the pasture. Sadie opened the gate to the new east section, the one they'd fenced through January and February, working on the coldest days in short bursts because the ground was too hard for sustained post-setting, and Mabel walked the roan through. She let the rope go slack, stepped back, waited. The roan stood in the center of the new section for a long time, not grazing, not moving, just taking the measure of the place. Her ears moved continuously, forward and back and sideways, cataloging sounds. Her nostrils worked. From the adjacent section, Clover had come to the shared fence line. She stood there and watched the new animal with that quality she had, the patient, assessing attention of something that has lived long enough in one place to feel territorial about it, but not aggressively territorial. Just present, establishing. The roan's ears went toward Clover. She looked at her for a moment. Then she put her head down and began slowly to graze. "She's scared," Sadie said quietly from beside Mabel. "She's been scared for a while," Mabel said. "She's going to need time." "How much time?" "However much she needs." They named her Fern because she had a tendency to find the shadiest, most overgrown corners of the new pasture section and stand in them, which seemed like the kind of name that fit. The adjustment period was longer than Hazel's had been. 6 weeks before the milk improved enough to be worth processing separately from the reserve. 8 weeks before Fern stopped pressing herself against the east fence when Sadie entered the pasture. What worked with Fern, they discovered through trial and failure, was predictability. The same person entering at the same time through the same gate, the same sequence of movements in the same order. Not rigid. You couldn't be rigid with animals and expect anything useful, but consistent. She needed to know what was coming. She needed the world to be legible. Mabel thought about that. About how many people she'd known who needed exactly the same thing and never got it, and how that got labeled as weakness or difficulty when it was really just a very reasonable response to an unpredictable world. She wrote it in the notebook. She wrote most things in the notebook now. Not just the dairy observations, but the broader pattern she was seeing. The way the method she'd developed with Clover was proving to have applications she hadn't anticipated. It was becoming something more than farming notes. She wasn't sure yet what to call it, but she kept writing. The spring and early summer of 1893 had a different quality than the years before. Not easier, but more layered. The operation had enough history to it now that things she'd once had to think through deliberately had become instinct. She knew the pasture the way she knew her own hands. She knew Clover's rhythms and Hazel's temperament and where Fern would be at any given hour. She knew the cold cellar's climate by feel, knew when the aging wheels were ready without always consulting the calendar. Sadie had grown into the work in a way that Mabel found both satisfying and slightly disorienting, the way watching anything grow could be. You tended it carefully, and then one day you looked up and it was larger than you'd been tracking, and you had to adjust your picture of it. Sadie ran the Clayfield delivery now, alone, which had taken Mabel 3 weeks to agree to and which Sadie had been ready for before Mabel admitted it. She handled Howard Vess's account with a directness that had surprised him at first, and then earned his respect, which was a trajectory Mabel recognized. She had also, without being asked, begun keeping her own supplementary notebook, a smaller one with observations about Hazel and Fern's patterns that cross-referenced with Mabel's main log. Mabel found this out when Sadie left it on the kitchen table one evening, and Mabel picked it up before realizing what it was. She read 3 pages before she set it down. She didn't say anything about it to Sadie directly, but the next morning she went to the general store and bought Sadie a better notebook, the same kind she used with the stiff gray cover, and left it on the table without comment. Sadie picked it up when she came in for breakfast and looked at it and looked at Mabel. "Thank you," she said. "Document everything," Mabel said, "including things that don't seem to matter." "I know," Sadie said, which was true. She did know. That was the point. The offer from Wichita came in June, and it didn't come through Greer this time. It came directly, in a letter addressed to the Cross Creek Dairy. That name had become fully official now, painted on the sign she'd put at the lane entrance the previous fall. Black letters on white-painted board, because if people were going to call it that, she was going to own it properly. The letter was from a man named Edmund Hale, who represented a wholesale purchasing concern that supplied restaurants and hotel kitchens across 3 counties. He had heard of her products through Agnes Pickering, he wrote, who had apparently recommended her operation specifically by name in a correspondence that had nothing to do with Mabel and everything to do with Hale's search for reliable regional suppliers. The letter was straightforward, no intermediary, no Greer-shaped shadow behind it, a direct inquiry about pricing, volume, capacity, and delivery logistics. She sat at the kitchen table with it for a long time. "Read it," she said to Sadie, who was across the table eating breakfast, and slid it over. Sadie read it, put it down. "That's the Wichita market," she said. "That's the Wichita market. Can we supply it?" Mabel looked at the window, running numbers in her head. 3 cows. Current output. The ceiling on what she could process with 2 people. "Not at current scale," she said. "Not reliably, at the volume he'd need to make the arrangement worth his time. So we'd need to grow before we could answer him. We'd need to know we could grow before we could commit to answering him honestly." She picked the letter up again. "I'm not going to tell a Wichita buyer I can do something I can't do. That's the fastest way to destroy 2 years of reputation in 1 season. Sadie looked at her steadily. What would it take? A fourth cow. Possibly a fifth, another person. She set the letter down. Money I don't have for the infrastructure. What if the Wichita arrangement funded the infrastructure? Only if the arrangement came after the infrastructure, not before. I won't promise volume I can't deliver. Sadie was quiet for a moment, and Mabel could see her working through it. The circular problem of needing growth to access the opportunity that would fund the growth. It was the problem every small operation faced, and most of them didn't survive. Ruth, Sadie said. Mabel looked at her. What about her? She's got capital. She's been careful with her money since her husband died. She's told you her operation is more than she needs at her age. Sadie paused. And she believes in what you're doing here. She said it to me last month when she came by. She said she'd never seen anything like what you've built. Mabel sat with this. She was not a person who asked for things easily. Not for help, not for money, not for anything that put her in the position of owing. She'd built the operation on the principle of self-sufficiency, because self-sufficiency was the only ground she'd found where nobody could pull out from under her. But Sadie wasn't wrong, and Mabel had learned slowly and at some cost that there was a difference between self-sufficiency and pride, and that one of them was a value worth protecting and the other could kill a business before the frost did. I'll talk to her, she said. Oh, Ruth Blanton listened to the whole proposition without interrupting, which was her habit when something was serious, and when Mabel finished, she was quiet long enough that the kitchen clock became audible. You're asking me to invest, Ruth said. I'm asking if you're interested in discussing it. There's a difference. Ruth's mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. What are the terms you're thinking? Mabel had written them out the night before, in the same clear way she wrote everything. No florid language, no hedging, just the numbers and the structure. A partial investment in exchange for a fixed return once the Wichita arrangement was established, with a timeline she'd calculated conservatively. She slid the paper across Ruth's table. Ruth read it. She was a careful reader, the kind who went back over a sentence when she wasn't sure she'd understood it rather than assuming. She went back over 2 sentences. This is fair, she said finally. I tried to make it fair. It's more than fair, honestly. Ruth set the paper down. You've undervalued what I'm getting. I don't want you to feel I took advantage. Ruth looked at her directly. Mabel, I've watched you build this operation for 2 years on nothing and stubbornness and a cow nobody wanted. I know exactly what I'm getting. She picked up her pen from the side table where she always kept it. Where do I sign? The 4th cow came in August from a family in Harker's Crossing who was leaving Kansas for good. One of the families that the dry years had finally pushed past endurance, loading a wagon with what they could carry and heading west. The cow was young, barely 2 years old, a pale cream-colored shorthorn with good conformation and a temperament that Mabel assessed in 10 minutes as uncertain rather than difficult. A young animal that hadn't settled yet, that was still forming. She was the easiest one to bring into the operation. Mabel thought that was probably because by this point the operation had its own culture. The other animals, the rhythm of the days, the particular quality of attention that she and Sadie brought to the work. And a young, uncertain animal slipped into that culture the way a person slipped into a household where things worked and felt, gradually, like it had always been part of it. They named her June for the month she should have been born, but wasn't. The family in Harker's Crossing had a story about a late delivery that Mabel only half listened to and immediately forgot. What mattered was what June was, not what she'd been through before. Sadie handled June's integration almost entirely, which was not something Mabel had planned, but which happened naturally because Sadie was the one who was there during the critical early days when Mabel was managing the correspondence with Edmund Hale and the planning that Ruth's investment had made possible. She watched Sadie with the young cow from the fence sometimes. The patience that had taken Sadie 6 weeks to find was now simply how she moved with animals, unhurried and specific, her hands doing what needed doing without hurry. Mabel felt something that was hard to name precisely. Satisfaction was part of it. Something more like continuity was the rest of it. The knowledge that what she'd worked out, not just the farming practices, but the whole approach, the method of attention before action, was passing to someone else, that it wasn't going to stop with her. Edmund Hale came out to the farm in September. She hadn't expected that. Most buyers conducted their business by letter, and then sent someone to assess the product before committing. But Hale came himself, on a Tuesday when the weather was clear and cool, and arrived in a well-maintained buggy that he drove himself, without a driver, which told her something about the kind of man he was before he opened his mouth. He was perhaps 50, lean, with a precise quality about him. His coat brushed, his manner exact without being cold. He shook her hand the way he would have shaken any business contact's hand, and then looked around at the farm with the assessing attention of someone who has looked at many operations and knows what the details mean. He asked to see the barn first, which was right. The barn told you more than the house. She showed him everything: the stalls, the animals, the processing area, the cold cellar with its aging wheels. She showed him the notebook, not all of it, not the private observations, but the production records, the yield logs, the quality documentation. She let him taste the current pressing of the aged hard cheese and watch his face when he did. He tasted it twice. The second time was the tell. "How long have you been operating?" he asked. "Dairy production formally for 2 years. The foundation of it goes back a little further." He nodded, looking at the aging shelves. "Mrs. Pickering said your butter was unlike anything she'd sourced locally. That's a strong statement from Agnes Pickering. She doesn't make statements she doesn't mean." "No, she doesn't." He turned to look at her directly. "Miss Cross, I want to discuss a purchasing arrangement that would require you to grow your output significantly. I'm prepared to offer terms that would support that growth, but I need to be confident that the quality scales with the quantity." "It won't if I rush it," she said flatly. "I need you to understand that going in. The quality comes from the method. The method takes time. If you need volume faster than I can grow it without compromising the product, we're going to have a problem." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not displeasure, almost its opposite. The look of a man who has been dealing with people who tell him what he wants to hear and has just heard something different. "How long would you need?" he said. 12 months to add capacity I'm confident in. I can commit to a partial supply agreement starting at 60 days. Enough for you to establish the quality with your accounts, not enough to promise what I can't yet deliver." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a conservative approach." "It's an honest one." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's talk terms." Sadie found out that evening when Mabel came in from walking Hale to his buggy and sat down at the kitchen table with the look of someone who has done a hard thing that went well. "Well," Sadie said, "partial supply starting in 60 days, full arrangement review in 12 months. Mabel put her hands flat on the table. "He agreed to our timeline." Sadie sat down across from her. "You didn't bend." "No. I thought maybe you would. With the Wichita buyer, with that much money on the table, if I'd bent, it would have been the wrong arrangement," Mabel said. "And we'd have been trying to fulfill promises we couldn't keep, which would have cost us the arrangement and the reputation both." Sadie was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you know he'd accept it?" Mabel thought about that. "I didn't. But I knew it was the right position regardless." She paused. "You can't run this kind of operation from a position of desperation, even when you're desperate. Maybe especially then." She looked at her hands on the table, the calluses, the rough skin, the ink stain on her right forefinger from the notebook pen that never quite washed out. "My father taught me that, actually, without meaning to. He used to make deals when he was scared, and they always cost him more than if he'd waited until he wasn't." Sadie looked at her. "You're scared now." "I'm terrified," Mabel said simply. "Of course I am. This is the biggest thing I've done, and there's real money involved and real obligation. But that's different from letting the fear make the decisions." She pushed her chair back. "Come on, evening milking." The fence along the east boundary was solid now. She'd had it rebuilt entirely after the cut, heavier gauge wire, better posts, sunk deeper. Frank Greer had gone quiet in the months since that winter, a silence that Mabel tracked the way she tracked everything, noting it without drawing conclusions. He'd had his own difficulties. She'd heard through Ruth that his supply arrangement with 2 of the Gilmore accounts had been complicated by consistency problems, that the butter he was producing had gotten uneven in a way that buyers noticed. She had not said anything about this to anyone, not even to Sadie. There was nothing to say. The work either held or it didn't. On an October evening, with the harvest moon coming up fat and orange over the flat Kansas horizon, She walked the fence line the way she did every evening, checking posts and wire by hand, the way her father had checked his crop rows, methodically, starting at the north corner and working east and south and west and back, touching each post, testing each span of wire. The pasture was quiet. Clover was in the elm corner, just visible in the fading light, a dark shape against the deeper dark of the tree. Hazel was near the water. Fern was in her shaded corner of the east section. June was somewhere in the middle, young enough still that she hadn't settled on a preferred spot, still exploring. 4 cows. Ruth's investment. A Wichita buyer with a signed preliminary agreement. Sadie Turner keeping her own notebook. 2 years ago, she'd stood at this fence with $14 in savings and one troublesome spotted cow that nobody else wanted. The arithmetic of it was almost too strange to look at directly. The distance between there and here, measured not in money, but in the specific accumulation of 1,000 small decisions made correctly under conditions that didn't invite correctness. She finished the fence check and stood at the north corner in the last of the light, looking across the pasture. The grass was going brown for winter, but the earth under it was good. She knew this ground now, knew its moods and its weaknesses and where it held water and where it drained. She had notes on all of it, 3 notebooks full of what the land had told her when she'd gotten quiet enough to listen. She turned and walked back toward the lights of the house, where Sadie had started supper and the smell of wood smoke was coming from the chimney, and the barn lantern was burning warm and steady in the early dark. The winter of 1893 into 1894 was the kind that settled arguments. It came early and stayed long and didn't apologize for either, dropping temperatures that cracked the wood on the barn's north wall and froze the seep in the south pasture for the first time in Mabel's memory of the place. She and Sadie worked through it the way they worked through everything, by showing up every morning, regardless of what the sky was doing. The preliminary supply agreement with Edmund Hale had been running for 2 months by the time the serious cold arrived, and it was holding. Not comfortably. The first delivery had been short by 4 pounds of butter because Fern had gone off her production for a week, in a way that the notebook eventually traced to a bad batch of supplemental feed from the Gilmore supplier, a problem Mabel addressed by switching suppliers and documenting the change and the reason for it in enough detail that if she ever needed to explain the gap in the Hale account, she could do so precisely. Hale's man in Wichita had noted the shortage in his correspondence, and she had responded with the same directness she brought to everything. Here is what happened. Here is what caused it. Here is what I changed. Here is what you can expect going forward. Hale himself wrote back, one line, in his spare exact hand, "This is how I prefer to do business." She had put that letter in the tin box. Oh, the 5th cow arrived in February, which was the wrong time of year to bring a new animal in, and which she'd been planning to avoid until she got the letter from a farmer named Goss, 40 miles northeast, whose entire dairy herd had been decimated by disease the previous fall. He had one survivor, a black cow, 4 years old, healthy but utterly alone, and he was selling the property and moving to his daughter's household in Missouri and couldn't take the animal with him. The price he named was almost nothing. The situation he described, 1 cow alone, the last of a herd, in winter, with the farm being sold out from under her, was one that Mabel understood in a way she couldn't have fully articulated and didn't try to. She and Sadie drove 40 miles in February to bring her home. The black cow, they named her Ada because she was serious and deserved a serious name, was thin from a hard winter and subdued in the way animals got when they'd been through something that took the energy out of them. She loaded into the wagon without resistance, which told you that the resistance had been used up. She stood in the barn on the first night without exploring, without eating much, without interacting with the other animals, and Mabel sat with her for an hour in the lamplight while Sadie slept, not doing anything useful, just being present in the same space. "You're here now," Mabel said out loud to the cow. It was the kind of thing she'd stopped being self-conscious about saying. Ada's ear turned toward her voice. That was all. It was enough. Spring came finally, the way it always did. Suddenly, after 6 weeks of pretending it might not, the temperature climbing in a single week, and the pasture going green almost overnight in the particular urgent way of prairie grass that has been waiting under snow. The seep unfroze and ran clear. The elm in the northeast corner put out its first leaves, small and yellow-green, and Clover moved to her corner on the first warm morning as if she'd simply been waiting for it to be ready. Ada took 6 weeks to find her footing, and when she did, she became something unexpected. She was not, as Mabel had assumed, a reduced version of what she'd once been. She was a settled, deliberate animal who moved through the pasture with a quality that reminded Mabel, strangely, of Clover. Not the same, Clover was entirely herself, but something in the category of an animal that had been through enough that it no longer wasted energy on anything unnecessary. Ada grazed efficiently. She chose good spots. She drank from the seep the second week she was there, which meant she'd found it herself. By April, her milk was good. By May, it was excellent. Mabel stood at the fence on a May morning with all 5 animals visible in the pasture. Clover in her elm corner, Hazel near the water, Fern in her shaded east section, June still moving between things in her young, exploratory way, and Ada in the center of the main pasture with the particular quality of an animal that is found where it belongs, and felt something that took her a moment to identify. It was not triumph. It was more ordinary than that and more durable. The specific satisfaction of looking at a thing you built and recognizing it as real. Not finished, because nothing worth doing was ever finished, but real. Functioning. Alive in all the practical senses of the word. She went in and wrote it down. The full supply agreement with Edmund Hale came through in June of 1894, 3 years after Mabel had stood at her gate and watched Dale Whitmore come down the lane with a rope and a problem he wanted to be rid of. The terms were better than she'd expected because she'd negotiated from the position she'd always negotiated from. Not desperation, not eagerness, but the steady ground of knowing exactly what she had and what it was worth. Hale had learned, over 8 months of the preliminary arrangement, that when Cross Creek Dairy said it would deliver something, that thing arrived on time and at the quality described and with documentation that explained any variation. He'd had dealings with a dozen regional suppliers. He told her this in his careful way, without flourish. She was the most reliable. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she wrote it in the notebook and kept working. The Wichita arrangement changed the arithmetic of the operation entirely. It wasn't wealth. She was careful to stay clear of that word in her own thinking, because wealth was a horizon that moved as you approached it, and she'd watched enough people ruin themselves chasing it to know better. But it was stability of a kind she hadn't had before. The kind where you could plan past the next season, where a bad week didn't threaten the whole structure. She paid Ruth back in full before the end of the year, with the agreed return, and Ruth accepted it with the same practical grace she'd extended the loan. No sentiment about it, just a careful woman completing a transaction with another careful woman. "You didn't need to rush it," Ruth said when Mabel arrived with the payment. "I know. I wanted to." She paused. "It mattered to me to do it when I said I would." Ruth looked at her across the table for a moment. "What's next?" she said. Mabel had been thinking about this. "I want to write it down properly," she said. "The method. Everything I've learned about the animals, the pasture management, the quality practices. Not just for my own records, something that someone else could follow." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "A guide. Something like that. Not a pamphlet. Something real." She looked at the window, at the afternoon light coming across Ruth's kitchen floor. "The agricultural publications that come through, they're written for men with hired hands and established operations. They assume a starting point I didn't have." She paused. "There are other people who are where I was 3 years ago. I'd like them to have something I didn't." Ruth looked at her steadily. "That's going to be a lot of work." "Yes," Mabel said. "I know." The guide, she called it simply Notes on Dairy Practice, refusing the impulse to give it a grander name, took her the better part of 2 winters to write, working in the evenings after the day's work was done, at the kitchen table with the lamp close and the notebooks open around her. Sadie contributed sections on the processing work, written in her own direct, unembellished way, and Mabel revised them only for consistency of format, not for voice, because Sadie's voice was her own now, and had earned its place in the document. It was not a sophisticated piece of writing. She knew that, but it was specific and honest and grounded in 3 years of daily observation, and those qualities, she had come to believe, were worth more than sophistication in most practical contexts. She had 12 copies made in Wichita by a printer Edmund Hale recommended, and sent them to the county agricultural offices, to Agnes Pickering, to Ruth, to Howard Vess in Clayfield, and to the handful of farmers in the surrounding region who had come to her in the years since the fence cut incident with questions about her methods. She sent one to Dale Whitmore with a note that was brief and without irony. "Thank you for the cow," Dale wrote back, which she hadn't expected. 2 lines. "I thought you were foolish for taking her. I've been wrong before." She put the letter in the tin box. The day she thought of later as the day things changed, the visible change, the one other people noticed, was an afternoon in September of 1895, when 2 men arrived from a city she hadn't heard of looking for the Cross Creek Dairy. They came in a hired buggy, and they were well dressed in the city way, and they had heard of her products through a hotel in Wichita that had been buying from Hale's distribution and which had, apparently, been fielding questions from its guests about the origin of what they were eating. Which was the thing nobody expected when Agnes Pickering had told her that people didn't generally think about butter. It turned out they thought about it when it was good enough to make them think. The men were buyers from a wholesale concern in Kansas City. They wanted to discuss a regional distribution arrangement that would have been, 4 years ago, beyond any version of the future she'd allowed herself to imagine. She offered them coffee and sat them at the kitchen table and listened to what they had to say. Then she explained her timeline and her terms and the non-negotiable primacy of quality over volume, the same way she'd explained it to Hale, without apology and without rushing. One of the men, the older one, named Barker, who had the look of someone accustomed to running meetings, leaned back in his chair and said, "Miss Cross, most producers we speak with are trying to sell us. You're trying to not sell us. I'm trying to make sure we understand each other before we commit to anything," she said. "I found that's more useful than selling." Barker looked at his colleague. Something passed between them that she couldn't read. Then he looked back at her. "How long have you been operating?" 4 years. "And your current output?" She told him. He wrote it down. "We'd want to start with a trial arrangement," he said. "Smaller volume, assess the logistics, the consistency." "That's what I'd propose anyway," Mabel said. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Sadie crossing the yard from the barn with the afternoon pails, moving with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly what she's doing and has been doing it long enough that it looks natural rather than practiced. Sadie glanced at the visitor's buggy and then at the kitchen window and raised an eyebrow. Mabel gave her nothing, because there was nothing certain yet, and she'd learned not to count things before they were solid. The men from Kansas City stayed 2 hours. They tasted 3 products: the aged hard cheese, the current pressing of the soft variety she'd developed the year before, and the butter, which always went last because it was the thing that had started everything. Both of them were quiet when they tasted the butter, the specific silence of something registering. They left with a preliminary proposal and a promise to write within the month. She walked them to the buggy and shook hands and watched them drive down the lane, and then stood there for a moment in the September afternoon before turning to find Sadie already at the fence behind her. "Well," Sadie said, "I don't know yet." "What's your feeling?" Mabel considered this. "Good," she said carefully. "But I've been wrong before, so I'm keeping the feeling at arm's length until I see something in writing." Sadie laughed, a short, genuine laugh that the Sadie of 3 years ago hadn't had yet, that had come in gradually with the confidence of someone settling into a life that fit them. "You are the least sentimental person I have ever met," she said. "I'm plenty sentimental," Mabel said. "I just don't let it run the operation." The Kansas City arrangement came through in November, and with it a stretch of months that Mabel would remember later not as triumphant, but as relentlessly demanding, which was another way of saying alive. The logistics of supplying 3 distribution channels at once required a level of coordination she hadn't had to manage before. And there were weeks when she and Sadie were both so tired by evening that conversation was reduced to essential information and the rest fell away. She hired 2 more people that winter. A young man named Cal Reeves, who was 17 and big enough to be useful with the heavy barn work, and who had the particular quality she looked for, which was that he listened more than he talked. And a woman from Harker's Crossing named Bet, who was 30 and had worked dairy before, and who could take the processing work that was outstripping what 2 people could manage. Training them was its own work. She and Sadie did it together, which was the first time Mabel had watched Sadie teach someone else the things Mabel had taught Sadie, and the experience had a quality she hadn't anticipated. Something recursive about it, the ideas traveling forward through people, The patience and the attention and the specific habit of watching before acting, moving from Clover to Mabel to Sadie to Cal and Betty. She watched Sadie explain to Cal why you didn't rush the milking, and the explanation was almost exactly what Mabel had said to Sadie 3 years earlier, and almost exactly what she'd understood herself by watching Clover. And it struck her then, not sentimentally, but with a plain, hard clarity, that this was the part of it that would last. Not the tin box under the floorboards, not the ledger numbers, not even the guide she'd written. The thing that would last was this: one person teaching another person how to pay attention, in a Kansas barn, in the early morning, over and over again into whatever came next. Frank Greer sold his dairy operation in the spring of 1896. She heard it through Ruth, who heard it from Agnes Pickering, who had apparently stopped purchasing from Greer's operation 2 years earlier, citing consistency problems, and had never reinstated the arrangement. His consolidation plan with Aldrich and the Wichita buyers had collapsed somewhere in its middle stages for reasons that never became entirely clear to Mabel. She didn't investigate, because investigating would have been a use of energy she had better things to do with. She thought about Greer sometimes, honestly, without satisfaction and without vindication, because neither of those feelings was quite accurate. What she felt was something closer to a kind of plain, sad understanding. He'd seen what she built and tried to take from it rather than build his own. And the taking had cost him, eventually, the same way all the wrong kinds of shortcuts cost you. Not all at once, but slowly, in the accumulation of small compromises that added up to something you couldn't recover from. She had made her own mistakes. Wrong decisions about timing, about scale, about people. She had pushed when she should have waited, and waited when she should have moved and second-guessed herself in the small hours more times than she could count. The operation was not the product of good judgment at every turn. It was the product of persistent judgment, making the next decision as well as she could with the information she had. And when she got it wrong, writing down what she'd gotten wrong and why and what she'd do differently. The notebooks were full now. She'd started a new one, the fourth, and it had a different quality than the first. Less anxious in the handwriting, more certain in the observations. The record of a person who had stopped being surprised by the difficulty of the work and had learned to carry it without letting it define her posture. Clover was 6 years old in the summer of 1896, which was not old for a cow, but was old enough that Mabel tracked her health with a careful attention that had a different quality than the attention she paid to the younger animals. The elm corner was still Clover's territory. The other animals had learned this as a fact of the pasture, the way you learned any geographical reality. June sometimes grazed near it, but pulled back when Clover moved toward it, not from fear, but from some animal understanding of whose place was whose. She was still producing, not at the same volume as her peak years, but the quality hadn't declined. If anything, it had deepened in a way that Mabel couldn't quantify, but could taste clearly. Agnes Pickering had said, at some point in the past year, that if she could sell the butter from that particular cow at a premium, she could charge double, and the hotel guests would pay it without question. Mabel had laughed and told her that wasn't how it worked, and Agnes had given her the look she gave people who were being obtuse about money. On a July evening, with the long summer light lying flat and gold across the pasture, Mabel walked to the elm corner and sat on the fence rail the way she had 5 years ago, watching Clover in the same spot, eating the same herbs, with the same unhurried deliberateness that had first made her stop and look twice at an animal everyone else had dismissed. Clover raised her head and looked at her. Brown eyes, large and damp, with that watchful quality that Mabel had never fully learned to describe and had stopped trying to. "You were a lot of trouble," Mabel said. "Worth every bit of it." Clover's tail switched once. She went back to the bergamot. Mabel sat there in the evening quiet and thought about the things that didn't fit into ledgers or notebooks. The particular quality of a Kansas pasture at the end of a long day. The sound of 4 other cows settling into their evening routines. The light coming through the elm leaves in patterns that changed as the breeze moved them. The way Sadie's laugh had changed over 3 years from something guarded to something real. The letter from Dale Whitmore in the tin box. The ink stain on her forefinger that never washed out. She thought about what her father would make of it. Honestly. Not in a sentimental way, just the plain question. He'd been a man who talked to himself in the garden, working through problems out loud. Now, here's what we've got. Here's what we can do with it. She thought he would have approved of the notebooks. He would have asked hard questions about the Kansas City margins. He would have liked Sadie. He would have had opinions about the cow, which she would have disagreed with for about a month before admitting he was right about the parts he was right about. That was how it had always worked between them. She missed him. She had finished the acute missing a long time ago, but the plain kind didn't go away and she'd stopped expecting it to. The thing she had not expected, the thing nobody had told her to expect, because nobody she knew had been through quite this particular set of circumstances to know what came after, was how much the operation changed her understanding of failure. She had spent the first 2 years of it terrified of failure in a way that she'd managed by documentation and contingency planning and the refusal to let fear make the decisions, which was the right way to manage it, but was still, underneath, a response to terror. The question that ran through everything was, what if it doesn't work? And the answer she gave herself was, then I will know exactly why, and I will have the records to prove I tried. What she understood now, 6 years in, with 5 cows and 2 employees and 3 distribution accounts and a guide sitting in a dozen agricultural offices across the county, was that the failure she'd been afraid of was the wrong unit of measurement. The right unit wasn't the operation. It was the decision. Each decision, each morning, each assessment, each moment of choosing patience over action or action over patience was its own complete thing. And if you made each one as well as you could with what you had, the operation was the accumulated result of that, not the other way around. She had not built a successful dairy. She had made 1,000 small decisions, mostly correct, some wrong, and this was what they added up to. The distinction mattered to her because it changed what you did the next morning. You didn't go out to maintain a successful dairy, you went out to make the next decision well. That was always the actual work. Clover had understood something like this from the beginning, she thought. Every morning, this specific patch of ground, this water, these plants, not the abstract idea of good grazing, the concrete thing right in front of her, assessed freshly and chosen deliberately. An animal that knew what it needed and went directly to it, without apology and without asking permission. Mabel had spent 6 years learning to do the same. In the fall of 1896, a young woman came to the farm from a settlement 30 miles south. She was 22 years old and her family's claim had failed, and she had heard of Cross Creek Dairy through a chain of acquaintance that Mabel never fully traced. And she arrived the way Sadie had arrived, with a bag that wasn't heavy enough to hold much, and her chin up against the uncertainty. Her name was Clara. Mabel brought her into the barn and showed her the cows and the processing setup and the notebooks, the same way she'd done with Sadie 4 years earlier. She showed her Clover in the elm corner, doing what she always did. "What's she doing?" Clara asked. "Grazing," Mabel said. "But specifically, she's choosing. Every day she chooses the same things in the same order, not because anyone told her to, but because she's paid attention long enough to know what works." Clara watched the cow for a moment. "She looks calm." "She's earned it," Mabel said. Clara turned to look at her, and Mabel saw in her face what she probably looked like herself once. The mixture of exhaustion and determination that a person wore when they'd been through enough to stop pretending and were looking for something that might actually hold. "The pay is small," Mabel said. It was the same thing she'd said to Sadie, word for word, because it was still true, and she was still honest about it. "The work is harder than it looks, and some of it is boring, and some of it is physically unpleasant, and there will be days when nothing goes right, and you have to do it anyway." Clara waited. "But I'll teach you everything I know," Mabel said, "and what I know is worth something now." Clara nodded. "When do I start?" "You already have," Mabel said, and handed her the second notebook, the one Sadie had graduated out of when Mabel had given her the better one, and a pen. "Write down what you see today. Everything, even what seems obvious, son." Clara opened the notebook and looked at the blank first page. "What if I don't know what matters yet?" she said. Mabel looked at her. It was the right question. It was the only question, really, at the beginning. "You don't," she said. "That's why you write everything down. The knowing comes later. The writing comes first." Oh shit. Clover died in March of 1898, on a cold morning that came in after a week of false spring, which felt like the kind of timing that didn't mean anything but which Mabel couldn't entirely convince herself was random. She found her in the elm corner, which was where she would have chosen to be, which was some version of comfort. She dug the grave herself, though Cal offered and Sadie offered, and even Clara, who had been there a year and a half by then, offered to help. She didn't refuse them out of sentiment. She refused because the work was something she needed to do with her own hands, the same way she'd needed to do 100 other things herself over the years, not to prove something to anyone watching, but because some things required the direct contact. Sadie came out when she was finished and stood beside her at the fence line, looking at the elm corner that would take a while to feel normal without Clover in it. They were quiet for a while. The wind moved through the pasture grass the way it always did. "She was remarkable," Sadie said finally. "She was particular," Mabel said. "That's different. Remarkable is something people decide after the fact. Particular is what you are every day, whether anyone is paying attention or not." Sadie looked at her sideways. "You really did learn everything from that cow." Mabel thought about it honestly. "Not everything," she said, "but the most important parts." She looked out at the elm corner one more time, the tree putting out its first small leaves in the March cold, early as always, impatient as always, growing in the same place it had always grown, and offering the same shade it had always offered to whoever needed it. Then she turned toward the barn, where the morning work was waiting, and the 4 remaining cows needed tending, and Sadie and Cal and Clara were ready to begin the day. She went to do the work. It was what she had always done. It was, she had come to understand, the whole of it. Not the destination, but the practice, the daily choosing, the attention paid and the record kept and the next decision made as well as you could make it. The woman everyone had expected to fail was still here. That, in the end, was the only answer that mattered.